to start now with our keynotes, and our first one is from Jaime Gonzalez and Carolyn White from the Nature Conservancy, talking about One Health in the City, a Houston story. A lot of our work so far is focused on rural communities and the rural areas of the circumpolar north, but One Health is it's the way things work everywhere. And I think for some folks, it's particularly difficult to see how it might work in a city or an urban environment, because a lot of times people are a bit removed from the natural side of things. But Jaime and his team have done an amazing job of trying to change that, and I hope you'll welcome him here this morning as he tells his story. Thank you.
All right, if you could bring up the first slide and turn up the sound just a little bit. I'm going to ground us real quick. We can hear this. I can't take you to Houston today. It's in the mid-80s. It's very humid, very different from here. I just want to ground you for about 30 seconds. We can just close our eyes. All right. I think I wanted to start this presentation between myself and my wonderful colleague, Carolyn White at Harris County Public Health, by grounding us in place, because if there was anything that really popped this week is the primacy of place and space and nature and how it binds us all, but also how it creates meaning and it creates dialogue between ourselves and the rest of the natural world. So we're going to go ahead and start, and I'm going to go ahead and get the clicker. I have put myself on a timer because the last thing you want to do is give a passionate Latino man enough time, because he'll just talk the whole time. I'm going to let Carolyn White introduce herself.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here presenting with Jaime at this conference. My name is Carolyn White, and I'm an urban environmental planner at Harris County Public Health, bringing One Health principles into the design and planning of the built environment for health equity, environmental justice, and community capacity building. I am also working with a multidisciplinary team across departments of Harris County to draft a flood resilience plan that will bring needed infrastructure to disinvested communities. Later in this presentation, we will be discussing the compounding climate-based challenges facing our community and the opportunities to address them using One Health. I will be providing an overview of our One Health toolkit that brings these principles into practice.
All right, one thing that we needed to mention is just gratitudes. One is that we're very thankful to the Denai people of the lower Tanana River for having us here on their lands. One thing that we're trying to do back in Houston is we're really trying to work with indigenous leaders to uplift presence and visibility. It's a place where there has been quite a bit of intentional attempts at erasure, both physically and culturally. So if we're going to get anywhere as a society in the United States, we're going to have to readopt indigeneity as a worldview. And we're very far away from that, but it doesn't mean that we're not started. Also, I wanted to thank Arlie, Hannah, Kelsey, and Lori. They have been exceptional partners, yes, in this journey that Carolyn and I are making and trying to bring this concept to not just Houston, but to other cities in the US. We found out about their program a while back when we took this edX course. I knew that we were looking for a name for what we had been doing, this intersectionality between conservation, environmental justice, public health, equity, climate readiness and justice, and incorporating, hopefully thoughtfully, indigenous worldviews in TEK. I didn't know what the word was. Now we do, One Health. I'm part of a cities network that is all spread out throughout the US with the Nature Conservancy. What we're trying to do is trying to get nature into cities for climate readiness, for nature equity, for human health. Carolyn works in a department, Harris County Public Health, in the Built Environment Group that is also charged with creating healthier environments for people, particularly in a place like Houston, which has so many inequities. I also wanted to say that we're trying to bring our full selves to this work. We're both artists, visual artists as well as scientists, and we're both parents. And that's really, really important. I'm gonna quote Ed Alexander. I was like furiously typing quotes yesterday, and he said that he had an unrelenting optimism in humanity to meet this moment. So do I. And if we didn't, we wouldn't be here. This is the room of hope and of strategic and systems thinking and change. So it's great being here with you all. Here's an admission from the beginning. We're never going to get through this presentation. It's too long. Here's our contact information if you want to talk more about it. So I front-loaded that knowing that it's just not going to happen. One thing I will say on here is that when I do the One Health diagram, I always include the temporal, the time circle. We're talking to our ancestors, our descendants right now about what kind of world they may inherit. We're trying to work on their behalf, but we also need to know all the facts of what happened in a place, whether that's systemic racism, whether that's slavery, which was in Houston, whether that's road building that cut apart neighborhoods, whether it was the extinguishing of species locally. And we also need to know all the good stuff. So what I'm going to tell you about my place, Houston, Texas, which is near and dear to me, is I oftentimes call it Houston, because there's always a superlative and there's always a counter in a place like this. So Houston is an amazing place. We'll talk about it real quick. So this is where it's located in Southeast Texas. So when we talk about Houston with a big H, we're talking about this blob in the middle there. It's about 10,000 square miles. It's home to a population of 7.7 million people, about 10 times the size of the Alaska population. It's a country unto itself. It's bigger than El Salvador or Israel. And ecologically, it's brilliant, but under threat. And it has a lot of superlatives, right? So it's the most ethnically diverse city in the US. A lot of people don't know that. It's gigantic, and its economy is huge. If it were its own country, my city would be the 25th largest economy in the world. But Houston, it comes with a cost as well. So we'll talk about it. And here's one of those. The energy industry is everywhere infused into our society. There are many good actors in the energy field. I'll just point that out. But my county produces more carbon dioxide than any county in the nation. We are number one by a shot. So what happens here in the Arctic has a direct correlation with what happens in my county. And I recognize that burden and that opportunity. Also, when we look at Alaska and Texas, probably some people are like, what the heck do they have to do together? Well, when we look at climate vulnerability, they're both very high places, and they've already been damaged to a certain degree. Also, areas of exceptional biodiversity, they're under risk. And people who need help. So one of the things I want to do is I do want to mention that working with Indigenous leaders on the side to uplift the 13,000-year, but very often overlooked or not even known history of Indigenous peoples on this land is really important. I would say that in Houston, probably because there are so many Hispanics or Latinx people, and most of them have a good amount of indigenous heritage. I have some myself. There are probably 300,000 to 400,000 people in that city that have some indigenous roots somewhere. So this story needs to be told, and it needs to be folded in. Had a really wonderful time. Well, let me play this real quick, and I'll tell you about that. This is my house in 2017. The rain started. They did not stop. They kept coming. That's a Coast Guard helicopter rescuing people off of roofs 4 blocks away from my house.
Here's all of our stuff. Heading to my parents-in-law on Ashwood.
There they are rescuing people right next to the bayou, the slow-moving river. The reason I'm showing this is not for shock value. This is why I have the job that I have. In 2017, I was working for a local land trust. Hurricane Harvey caused $125 billion of damage, the second most costly natural disaster in US history. There was so much rain that came down that the National Weather Service had to change the color coding for precipitation on their map. It was literally off the charts. Since 2015, we've had 4 other storms that are at least 500-year events or more. We've had a freak Arctic storm, and we had a brutal mini drought last summer. So when I look at my city, and Carolyn and I look at our city, what we see is a city on the edge. And it's because of climate change, but also pre-existing inequities in health, in climate readiness, in terms of air pollution and water pollution and environmental justice issues, access to health care. So what we're seeing is we're seeing all of this change really, really quickly, and we're also seeing something else which is really important. The diminishment of one of the most biodiverse areas in the US. In 2018, I was able to present at the Biodiversity Hotspot Cities conference at the University of Pennsylvania. At that meeting, we were designated as one of 33 cities in the world that is a hotspot biodiverse city, which means exceptional biodiversity under great risk and threat. The only other US city, Los Angeles. So it's not for nothing that when we look at the nature that surrounds Houston and is infused in Houston to a certain degree, it needs to be saved as much as the people. So when we think about this One Health benefits, we can't ever go back to planning just for the people, because we know that the biodiversity regulates the systems which keep the people safe, and those systems are failing. We also know that the biodiversity, the animals and plants of that place that have been there since time immemorial are beings and stakeholders on the land. And even though it is not de rigueur to do urban planning with biodiversity in mind, or to give them a metaphorical seat at the table, this is what we are moving forward with. So like I said, Houston is in the midst, and many places, including the Arctic, are really in the midst of a complicated, tangled crisis of life on Earth. Equity, climate, biodiversity collapse, and I'm, of course, not mentioning pandemics or nuclear proliferation. Those are also existential threats. So what do we do in a city that has had redlining and the impacts of so many processes, has a green space deficit? Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to recognize what a community is. You have to redefine it. I have never been to a public planning meeting that I have not led where indigenous species are listed explicitly as community members. This is the hubris of people, oftentimes, or the ignorance. But in planning processes that we are leading now in Houston, Harris County, under the One Health umbrella, we are being very direct with people about this stakeholdership, this need to protect biodiversity for itself and for the safety, comfort, and the awe factor of the people. And like I said, One Health is a great construct, it's a great name. Public health sector is really kind of getting it, but it would be erroneous to not mention that this is really an indigenous worldview that we're seeing through a new lens. So we want to make sure to always do that. And lastly, here, it has changed my view of what my job is. It used to be that I would think my job was to invite more people into the conservation tent. I don't believe that anymore. I think that was always erroneous. My job is to camp with everybody else, as peers, as equals, to learn from them, as I've learned from all of you from so many disciplines, and to get to a better place that way. Not by making them me, but by seeing them. So, sometimes people ask me who are not familiar with this concept, especially in conservation, well, what is this One Health thing? Is it framing? Is it a project? What is it? And I always say yes to everything. Because it is a way to reframe the problems. It's a way to plan differently. It's a way to look at projects differently. So the way that Carolyn and I will spec a tree planting through a One Health lens is way different than what we would do if we just wanted to put up tree canopy kind of randomly with fast-growing trees. With fast-growing trees, I could pick any species that works. And it's like a substitute for, it's almost like putting pipes in. You don't really care what the being or the meaning of that thing is, and you also don't really care about how it's going to impact wildlife. But we have to be very specific when we do it through a One Health lens because it's for the people, but it's also for the other community members. Policy and partnerships. And the partnerships is conservation has a storied history, some of it, much of it really awesome, some of it not so awesome as we all know, but it also has a cap. There are only so many people that are going to come to the table to work on conservation. We've reached that cap. We probably reached it a long time ago. So what we need to do is we need to bring together other sectors to help us with this work because conservation is a human health issue, and so we need to embrace it. So real quickly, the hows and then the whats. So the hows are understanding this. In big cities like Houston, we have a lot of lazy landscapes, a lot of landscapes that we have to put energy and money into, and which give us back air pollution, heat, a lack of a sense of place, and other things that are, and also hardened structures that can't absorb all the water that we need to soak up. Why are we doing this? We have so many underperforming spaces. And mind you, I mow in January. So this is not something like we get winter and then we don't know. We're mowing 30 to 50 times all these spaces with all the toxins that come from that, all the carbon emissions. So it's admitting to yourself like the Downton Abbey type landscapes that we have put in to make us look like lords and the ladies born, just not working anymore. We have a different world. We can't do that. So what are we doing? We're doing research. We're getting information. But basically, the source code is there. We have these local prairies, local woodlands, local riparian forests, and local upland forests, which are the source code for where we can go with nature and nature-based solutions. But also remember this. When I come to Alaska, and it's just a brilliant place, the connection between the people and the land and their identity is amazing. But know that it's not like that everywhere. In Houston right now, we have the world's largest rodeo going on. And yet, virtually no one knows that the reason we had a rodeo is because we were sitting on a prairie and we had a big ranching community. There has been a huge cultural disconnect between the land and the culture. So as we rebuild nature, we're also placemaking. And that's really important for spiritual and cultural health. All right, I'm going to let Carolyn take it from here.
Houston, located in Harris County, is the fourth largest city in the U.S. Larger than the state of Rhode Island and more populous than many states, Harris County is a cultural and diverse hotspot with many opportunities to incorporate One Health principles into planning, design, and policies. This morning, I will highlight some challenges and provide a framework that incorporates One Health in urban planning. Given our location in the Gulf Coast with flat topography and poorly drained soils, we are highly susceptible to major flooding along all of our bayous. The extensive petrochemical industry footprint results in poor air quality throughout the county, and our population growth and sprawl continues to create challenges for heat adaptations. Overlaying social vulnerability indicators on these physical factors demonstrates a widespread challenge for all. Vulnerable communities can be found throughout Harris County and in multiple watersheds. Resultant health outcomes are a concern, and as shown in the map, disparities in life expectancy are extreme. These challenges not only affect human health outcomes, but also the health of our environment and wildlife. Much of our landscape ecology is dictated by past discriminatory practices such as redlining, disparities in infrastructure investments, alignments of major transportation corridors, and the uneven protection and fragmentation of our natural resources. When we look at the core of Houston, inside the loop, we can see how redlining practices were used to locate major freeways and rail yards. Many of these marginalized communities continue to be vulnerable today. Using a holistic approach to address these determinants of health, we have created a One Health toolkit for community leaders, designers, planners, and policymakers to intentionally improve collective health outcomes. This toolkit recognizes that project implementation that takes a One Health approach can result in resource efficiencies, greater value, and more effective risk management practices. It is intended to consider unspoken stakeholders such as nature and animals. Through this practice, the toolkit explores how a well-designed, built environment can benefit human health, animal health, and the environmental health, and highlights the intersectional benefits achieved when all three considerations are equally prioritized. The One Health Toolkit provides built environment recommendations to improve One Health. These actions range from site-specific improvements to neighborhood or landscape scale interventions that can bring nature into a community and benefit One Health. Actions fall within the general categories as they relate to the built environment: mobility actions, stormwater management, architectural and structural features, nature-based solutions, and community capacity building. For each action, we evaluate benefits to human health, wildlife and biodiversity, and environmental health. While Houston has its challenges in adapting to climate changes, there are also a broad basis for conserving and enhancing its biodiversity. Bringing more of the riparian corridors into a greenway system, working with Parks Departments, Harris County Flood Control District, and other community nonprofit organizations to expand natural resource conservation, we can provide healthy corridors for wildlife and biodiverse natural lands that are woven into our built environment. There is a lot of pressure for development of vacant lands, and by working with developers to adapt policies and practices outlined in our Healthy Development Guide and the One Health Toolkit, we can improve health outcomes across the county. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Carolyn. So it is very important for me to mention that even though Carolyn is not here, she wanted to be here, but without her, One Health would not be a thing in Harris County, so big applause for Carolyn. All right, and lastly, we have to recognize this. If I'm strictly coming from a conservation viewpoint, I would not be able to work side by side with communities to empower them to get the nature-based solutions in their neighborhoods that are needed, because there is a flood of money coming from the IRA, from Justice 40 and other things to remediate and combat environmental injustice. We can tap into that money, and it doesn't have to be an EJ thing or a conservation thing or a public health thing. It can be a One Health thing if we do this right. We have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, so Carolyn and I are meeting with many, many stakeholders around how do we pull down some of this money to forest some neighborhoods that are particularly hot, to pick green stormwater and others that are particularly wet, and to create prairie lands that do a multitude of benefits. All right, so let's get to the what real quick. So how do you do this, and what does it look like? I'm just gonna give you a couple of examples. So here's one that's near and dear to my heart. The way that schools are built in Houston-Harris County is that they usually come in, they take a wild place, they knock it all down, they put the worst soil that they can possibly find, which is the cheapest soil. They put the code minimum trees on it, which for a campus like this is called the Jefferson Early Learning Center, would be about 20. Well, we're working with a really amazing landscape or architecture firm called PBK, the largest in Texas and California. We said, what if we did this differently? So instead of that, in terms of creating this massive lawn that needs to be mowed and is creating all of these environmental detriments. By the way, lawns in Houston has been tested. They soak up less than a half an inch of water before it starts to run off and become your neighbor's problem. Prairies, on the other hand, can soak up multiple inches of rain per hour, right? And wetlands also. So let's build spongy, cool places. So we planted about 4.5 acres of prairie wetlands on this preschool campus, and we're gonna go over 200 native trees. So in essence, what we're doing here for these over 400 wonderful, beautiful 4- and 5-year-olds is we're creating a mini national park. Most of these kids are apartment dwellers. They can't literally afford to go to a state park or a national park. They can't even get to the periphery of the city oftentimes. So if we're going to bring nature to the people, we're going to have to bring it at scale. And if green infrastructure is going to do anything, I love pollinator gardens. I've done them on over 40 campuses, but they're small. We need big nature to combat the issues that we have in terms of nature equity, climate readiness, and biodiversity loss. We planted this right before the drought hit, so it's been backed up a little bit. But already it's home to migratory birds. 4 species of sparrows visited this winter. We had kestrels, we had red-tailed hawks, we had a lot of different species. It's starting to pop to life. And it's brilliant because what we're trying to do is really get to a more resilient place, all the way from the very rural areas to the suburban areas to the middle of the city core. I'm not a city conservationist. I'm a landscape conservationist. I want to tie all the threads all the way through. And it's for that reason that that gentleman right there at the bottom, that's Melissa Turnbaugh, the really super talented architect I'm working with. But the gigantic Iowan next to her is one of our preserve managers. We actually got the seeds from that beautiful preserve to work on projects in the city. Country preserves, city resilience. Everything is tied together. Let's make sure that it works that way. So now this thing is really popping. The kids are getting excited. We're working on curricula. And they don't need to go to a state park in order to have a good quality nature experience. And we're doing a triple bottom line analysis of how this campus is different than other campuses. But it's pretty astounding, the difference. All right, I am actually gonna be okay. I'm gonna just show you, I'm just gonna back up real quick, play this real quick. So this is Mary Carol Edwards, who's just an amazing plant grower that's just south of Houston. And we're planting. I'm out here with Mary Carol Edwards. We are planting some wetland plants that she and her team at Green Star Wetland Farms have grown for this Early Learning Center in A-Leaf, the Jefferson Early Learning Center. Hey, tell me a little bit about what you brought out for us today.
Well, we brought plants that we are pretty sure will do just fine here at the bottom of the basins. These basins they look like they're maybe 6 or 7 feet deep, which actually gives a lot of, various habitat levels. The upper levels will be planted with prairie plants, seeded, and down below we're putting in pots of, oh, this is terrible.
See, that was a lot of fun. One of the main points I wanted to show there is there are going to be many green jobs created for the rehabilitation, the healing of the land. She actually is really good at employing people of color, employing women, to empower them to be a part of this green revolution. So I'm very proud of the work that my friend Mary Carol is doing. And supporting businesses like that with our contracts is super important. Here's the big enchilada from my perspective. We're working with a community called called Gulfton. What I tell people about Gulfton is it is a neighborhood and it is also the world. Why? It's the most diverse neighborhood in the state. It's home to people from over 50 nations. It's our Ellis Island. It's a place where people who have been driven from places because of climate change, war, famine, this is where they come to live. Unfortunately, this is the most concrete and physically hottest neighborhood in the city, with sidewalk temperatures often going above 125 degrees, where moms are walking with their kids. So when I do the scientific work that I do and we use mapping, we always have to remember that people are not polygons. People are people, and their lived experience matters so much. And when I see a mom walking with her kids and she's on concrete so hot you can feel it through your shoes, that's an injustice that needs to be remedied. So we worked with these community ambassadors who were paid for their work, by the way, because nobody has time to volunteer. And we crafted what's called the Greener Gulfton Plan. And we went to them and said, what if we did a One Health plan? And they pushed us. They said, we want to remember our ancestors. We want to remember the Karankawa people that were here. We want to include wildlife as members of the community. So one thing I tell people is the absence of nature is not the proof of not caring. Oftentimes it's the proof of disinvestment, the proof of being shut out, the proof of being disenfranchised. People are people, they love nature. They want it. Sometimes they just don't have the money or the juice to get it. So we're going to go after a lot of federal funding to do things. So it's going to create green corridors. We're going to work on shade shelters like this. So if you look at the top image, that's a real image of a place where people live. And I went to high school and was born in a neighborhood in North Philadelphia that was even more concreted than that. That landscape is damaging to human health. It's not neutral. Studies have shown that if you live in very concrete places, it hurts your self-esteem, your feelings of self-worth, your efficacy. So those landscapes are actively harming children and people every single day. It's not neutral. So we want to take away the harm, we want to add beauty, we want to add art, and we want to add the species that will give a child in that neighborhood a chance to see a monarch butterfly or hear a bird chorus. So we're working on that. We came up with a guide and these cards. A group called Asakura Robinson came up with these cards that show the benefits, the health benefits, the climate benefits, all of these benefits. And I'm going to end this talk by letting Maria Rodriguez speak for herself and her community for just a minute.
A greening plan and a nature plan is needed for Gulfton because if you visit, if you live in it, work, worship, play in it, you see that there is absolutely very little green space, very little tree canopies. Personally, as someone who has lived in the area for almost 40 years, as I was raising my kiddos, I, at that time, did not have the funds to take my kids to go camping, go to a state park, or even barely make it to Galveston, to expose my children to nature. I did take them to the zoo and to other areas in the city, but why can't I take my kids just down the street to a neighborhood park to have access to it? I don't want to drive across the city for them to experience nature. We live in an apartment complex, and many of our residents and neighbors live in an apartment complex, and even in the properties, there is no access to green space, very limited access to green space. When you see our children playing outside and recreation activities, they're playing in the parking lot. They're playing soccer in the parking lot, playing dodgeball or whatever, they're out in the parking lot. That is not a conducive environment for my kids. And so I think it's also helpful for our mental wellness, for our physical health, and for us to breathe the fresh air.
Just because we're time limited, I'm going to go ahead and stop her, not because she's not brilliant and one of my heroes in this process. The last thing I will say is, getting past this, is letting people, and we heard this earlier, not only own the data, but collect the data through participatory research when you can. I'm a huge proponent, as is Carolyn, of community science. We worked with Harris County Public Health, the City of Houston, and a group called HARC in 2020 to do the largest heat mapping campaign using volunteers in the history of the US, 3 times bigger than the previous one. That data is now owned in common by the people as open source data, and it's being used right now to talk about ARPA funding, to talk about IRA funding. It is the basis of what we're going to think about partially in terms of these interventions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and just thank you one more time for having us here. We are still in the baby stage, we're learning, but I have drawn so much energy from the people in this room, from the land and waters of this place, and I will take that back to the city and our cities network, and Carolyn will take it back to all of her colleagues far and wide, and we thank you.